Welcome to the 128th season of the Canadian Club Toronto, Canada's Podium. For over a century, this platform has been a gathering place for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to discuss the most pressing issues of our time.
We've been having important discussions and debates around this podium in this country for well over a century. I call this a historic podium of record.
Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Forrestel, a Canadian Club Toronto director and your host. Welcome to those joining us online. Our ability to bring you engaging speakers is due to the support of our sponsors. And today's event is being generously sponsored by Crestview Strategy. We appreciate your support. We're grateful to the Canadian Bankers Association as our season sponsor and Air Canada as our official airline sponsor. Canada's Forest Trust Corporation is our smart forest planting partner, and through this partnership, we've planted and protected over 1,250 trees to date, which is estimated to capture about 200,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide throughout its lifetime. And today, we're pleased to welcome students from Rotman School of Management. Thank you for joining us. We expect some great questions from your table. Before I introduce our speaker, let me share some club business with you. I invite you to visit our website at canadianclub.org. Besides event and membership information, we've got a great on-demand feature. And I also encourage everyone to share information and experience from today's event on your favorite social media platforms. I'm going to be moderating a question and answer portion of today's event, and we welcome your questions, so please take a moment to fill out the Q&A cards that you'll find on your table, and our team will be collecting them throughout the lunch. And for those who are joining online, please hit the red Q&A button on the right side of your screen when we open the floor for questions. And now, on to our speaker. Stephen Poloz is a widely recognized economist with nearly 40 years of experience in financial markets, forecasting, and economic policy, including 35 years in the public sector. I've personally come to know Stephen as a member of the advisory board for the Lawrence National Center for Policy and Management, which he chairs. He's incredibly bright, down to earth, and practical, and I enjoy every moment I get to spend with him. I came to know of him when he served as CEO of Export Development Canada, and I suspect all of us came to know of him and his leadership when he served as Governor of the Bank of Canada. Stephen led the bank for a number of years, including while Canada implemented its response to COVID, and the bank managed the economic, financial, and market impacts. At the time, I was working for the President and CEO of Scotiabank, and so I had a front row seat to see Stephen reassure Canadians and businesses, work to keep markets functioning, and respond to events in real time. As a Canadian, I'm incredibly proud of what he did in those first 6 months when the risk was the greatest. He worked with financial institutions, businesses, and the public service to protect the country. For this and for so many other contributions to our nation, he was awarded the Order of Canada. And last spring, he was named chair of a new federal economic working group tasked with finding more opportunities for Canada's largest pension funds as a way to drive economic growth. So as we face the threat of tariffs and the challenges of domestic barriers to growth, the topics that he's going to address today have never been more pressing. Stephen, Canada's podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, for that wonderful introduction. That's very kind, especially that 40-year bit. Yeah. Well, it's a real privilege for me to be invited to this prestigious podium. It really is Canada's podium. And it's a real pleasure to be here representing Osler, which is the best law firm in Canada. But to be completely candid, I find myself almost speechless today. I mean it in the basic sense of the word, given the events of the last couple of weeks. And that's a rare thing for me. Most people will attest. So what I hope I can do today is to bring a voice of reason into the room, try to separate some of the reality from hype, separate the logical from the absurd, and maybe give you something of value that you can take away that'll last more than 48 hours. So yes, here we are. Someday we will tell our grandchildren that we were here during the Trump Renaissance. Tariff man is back. And overnight, we're plunged into a crisis of epic proportions. Political rhetoric has basically gone off the charts. We hear words like trade war, devastating. We'll be out of business in a week. We even hear the E word, existential. And beyond retaliation, which of course is regarded as necessary, just to show that we will stand up to a bully, we're getting ready to roll out policies like the ones we used during the last crisis, the COVID pandemic. So all of this kind of fills a need, right? But what I feel the need for is to help inform the conversation and get some numbers in front of people. And the basic questions, and you could ask this question out on the street, and you get a lot of different answers. So let's talk about them. What's the actual downside of these tariffs? And there's no doubt, when you hear 25%, I mean, that's a tax. Who pays a 25% tax on something? It sounds cataclysmic. What will tariff retaliation cost? How low will the Canadian dollar go? And can we even win a war? Now, the answers to these questions simply can't be definitive. We're just going to speculate on some of them. We can do arithmetic. We can do arithmetic around the tariffs, but we can't predict future behavior, the human reactions that are underneath, the things that models purport to capture, okay? One thing we learned from the pandemic, and I'm not hearing today, is that our starting point matters. When the pandemic hit, people were asked to isolate themselves. Policymakers are trying to turn the economy off, stop the clock, probably for many months. We expected, in the center, we expected the impact on the economy to be truly massive. And many people thought it would take a really, really long time to recover from it. And economic activity fell by 20% in the summer of 2020. 20%. That's gigantic. And yet, to tell you the truth, it's not nearly as big as many of us were expecting. I mean, we turned the whole thing off. How did it only go down 20? But as I said at the time, though, the Canadian economy was really like a fit person. A fit person should be able to shake off COVID. So could a healthy Canadian economy. And my reasoning at the time was that Canada's inflation rate was right on target at 2%, just saying. And our unemployment rate was at a 40-year low, just saying. But can you think of a better situation in which to confront a major shock? Well, I can't. And as it happens, sure enough, the economy snapped back very rapidly. It was our best case scenario that we thought up that actually emerged. Very lucky. Well, what about today? Well, today we approached the Trump tariff shock with our economy in a very fragile position. We're still working our way through the mortgage renewal cycle, having raised interest rates by 500 basis points. That mortgage renewal cycle is sucking huge amounts of purchasing power out of Canadian households, and we're not done. We've been essentially in a recession in Canada for the last 2 years as household spending per household has been falling during those 2 years. That's what happens in recessions. Unemployment has risen significantly. Young people, the 15 to 25 age group, face the worst job market since the late 1990s. And these are this is the same cohort that got their post-secondary education messed up by having to do it online during COVID. Business investment, extremely weak, and its underlying trend has been lackluster for fully 10 years. Now, the return of Tariff Man and his unpredictability will accentuate that weakness, whether the tariffs go into effect or not. This is what happened during his first term in office. It will happen again, regardless. A strong immigration into Canada has masked these conditions that I've just described. But that underlying weakness, the recessionary type conditions, is exactly why inflation returned to 2% more than a year ahead of time, ahead of schedule laid out by the Bank of Canada and forecast by economists. Therefore, a tariff shock from the U.S. will land on a very fragile economy here in Canada. Its dynamics are not good. Therefore, we need to understand that the impacts may prove to be even larger than what economists are giving us. For a moment now, I want to set aside that concern and keep it as, in our minds, it could be bigger than what we say. But let's consider those estimates and try to put them into more perspective. Most of the estimates are clustering around a 4 to 5% loss of total Canadian income, GDP, if you like. That assumes, of course, that we retaliate with tariffs of our own, which, that seems to be the main intention. Without retaliation, the loss would be smaller, which is true in every war, right? Okay. In that sense, it is a war. Importantly, this loss of income, around 4 to 5%, would be permanent. It's not just this year and next year. The economy can start to grow again after maybe a couple of years, but our incomes here in Canada will stay 5% below the original path forever because of the tariffs. It's also widely believed that the Canadian dollar would depreciate significantly at the same time, but no one knows by how much. But what are the limits on it? Well, this is exactly why we have a floating exchange rate, right? So it can act as a shock absorber. Well, here comes a big shock. I hope those shocks are working. It's worth reminding ourselves that during the collapse of oil prices in 2014-15, the Canadian dollar depreciated by, everybody remember, around 20%. Now, you could easily imagine something similar happening in response to these tariffs, but obviously it could be smaller. I'm not going to hazard a guess, but I'm kind of thinking on the big side. That's what exchange rate flexibility is for. If the exchange rate does its job as a shock absorber, it could be a very significant decline, in which case it's conceivable that there could be almost no impact at all on U.S. consumers. Okay? Almost no impact at all on U.S. consumer prices. So no inflation surge that we've been saying is going to happen. Canadian exporters would be very much cushioned if the Canadian dollar went down that much, right? So they would be cushioned from the tariff effect besides. That may sound like a free lunch if exchange rates do the job, but no. A major depreciation would mean another significant cut to Canadians' generalized purchasing power. Prices here would rise because of the retaliatory tariffs, and then there would be another effect on top of that from the exchange rate depreciation. So this is where Trump's claim that Americans won't pay the tariffs, Canadians will, actually is possible. And that basic thinking, along with his intention to create an external revenue service to complement the IRS, makes me concerned about the long-term game. I'm concerned that no matter what sort of deal we negotiate, there's very likely to be a permanent regime of tariffs in the United States, probably not 25%, but tariffs. And those tariffs will be of some magnitude, and they'll be a significant generator of government revenue for the United States. And of course, I have no idea where we're going to end up through all these talks, but I think we need to be prepared for a new world where tariffs are more widely used in that way, distorting trade in its various forms, of course, not just by the United States, but by many countries, in an attempt to keep playing fields as roughly equal as is possible, so including here in Canada. So if the U.S. does modify its fiscal architecture in that way, its trading partners probably will follow, including ourselves. Now, if Trump is using that to support personal tax cuts, that would be his core story, we can do exactly the same thing, right? Our own government has already said they will find a mechanism for directing any tariff revenue that is collected back out into those impacted. Well, that's the same as a tax cut. Now, by the way, back in the day, before some genius invented income taxes, governments did rely mostly on tariffs to fund themselves. So it's not without precedent. So it may be back to the future, and we should be doing some scenario planning around that scenario. So, a recession combined with rising inflation, hey, there's a term for that. It's from the 1970s. I might be the only one here that lived there. There may be one or two others. Stagflation. And given our starting point, where we start with such a weak economy, I would expect Canada to see more stag, less inflation. Okay? But it's a hard call to make because it depends totally on how low the Canadian dollar goes. And I don't know that. Now let's stop speculating and think about the various options that we have in front of us. With the very likely 5% permanent loss of income, those are our chips on the table. Now, my first observation is that a 5% loss of income that's pretty bad. No one wants to take a 5% pay cut. Much rather have a raise. But let's be clear, that's not existential. It may be existential for certain companies and, of course, their employees. But it won't be if our flexible exchange rate does its job. And were we to decide not to retaliate, we could probably reduce that impact quite a lot. Maybe it would be half as big, let's say. So we have some control over the size of the impact. Second observation, let's suppose that Trump's main objective through all this is just to get Canada to pay our fair share for national defense. This is where I'm willing to use the E word, existential. We live in a geopolitically fraught world. We simply cannot defend our entire geography all by ourselves. Not a chance. So ask yourself, with that 5% loss of income, the chips on the table, does boosting our own taxes by 1 or 2% and putting the money into national defense sound that bad? Maybe that's a path we should be thinking about more seriously. Third observation, economists estimate that dismantling the rules and regulations that restrict interprovincial trade would add between 4 and 7 percentage points onto our incomes. Free money. Okay? Forever. Wow. We could completely offset the tariff shock that Trump has plans for us. This so-called existential tariff could be completely offset just by getting rid of those silly rules between provinces. Well, let's get on with that. By the way, it is worth remembering that back in 1866, the U.S. walked away from its free trade agreement with the provinces of Canada. What was our response then? Confederation. Imagine that. Our founding fathers thought they were creating a unified East-West free trade zone so that we could reduce our dependence on trade with the United States. The irony is almost too much for me to handle. Now, there may be a lot of other policy pathways that suddenly look reasonable when that 5% pile of chips is sitting on the table. So let's keep that in our minds as we go through the coming weeks. My fourth observation, regardless of how things turn out, I think it should be obvious that we should never allow ourselves to become this vulnerable again. We need to invest more in our own resilience, in our ability to grow our economy, so we can absorb this shock and whatever else might be on the horizon. So let's talk for a minute about what that might look like. Now, right now, I ask you to picture a flock of Canada geese flying north in springtime in a majestic V formation. I think it's a beautiful vision. I do. I really do. How's that? Okay. Have you ever wondered how they form that perfect V? You know, maybe they spent a few weeks doing basic training at CFP Borden. No, this is Mother Nature at work. Each individual goose is maneuvering to find the perfect spot behind the next goose where there's the least headwind, where it's easiest to fly. Now, obviously, flying is harder the closer the goose is to the front of the V. The front goose is doing all the hard work. And I think that image is a very appropriate metaphor for the long sweep of global economic history. You think of each goose as representing a country, with the V forging ahead along a pathway of technological progress. So today, the flock is just beginning to enjoy the updraft of the fourth industrial revolution, the digitalization of all of our businesses and the deployment of AI to knit it all together. And those geese, they've done this before. They did it during the third industrial revolution, the computer chip and the internet. They did it during the second industrial revolution. That was the spread of electricity. And they did it during the first industrial revolution, the spread of the steam engine. So they know where they're headed. The Canada geese know where to go. They're headed to a more prosperous future, riding the fourth major leap in general purpose technology in all of economic history. It's a very important time we're at. Now, maybe it seems ironic to you, but of course the lead Canada goose today is an American. They don't call them an American goose, though. Still a Canada goose. And that's okay, as long as the Canadian Canada goose is keeping up with the flock. But we haven't been, have we? At least not for our economy as a whole. Individual companies, I can point to lots of companies, maybe some in the room, that have been keeping up, maybe more than keeping up. Productivity growth is high among the companies listed on the TSX because they're digitizing, investing, getting it done. But the other 80% of our economy has been lagging badly for all kinds of reasons. But business investment in particular has been weak for 10 years, and low productivity is the net result. Now, I could talk at length about all the reasons: permitting, red tape, taxes, blah, blah, blah. We all know those things. Trade uncertainty, as I mentioned before, that started with candidate Trump, 10 years ago. It's never gone away. Now, Canadian companies have been investing south of the border since around that time, 2015-16, to build a natural hedge against exactly what we're facing today. And indeed, we should know that Canadians have more than $1 trillion in assets in the United States. And all this is, of course, causing the Canadian Canada goose to fall back in the V formation, almost to the back, according to the OECD. But something that's being overlooked is that the government has been a big player in this. They have become a bigger player in our economy. And the fact is, when government spends a bigger share of the economy, the private sector must shrink its share. Economists have a word for this. It's called crowding out. Now consider that in the last Harper budget in 2015, federal program expenses, that's just core spending, represented 13% of the Canadian economy. The first Trudeau budget the following year boosted that line to 15%. Some of it was described as temporary. a pandemic and some new programs, very interesting and actually programs we like. A few more programs later, the share today is 16%, so a 3% increment. Doesn't sound like that much, but this expansion means that the private sector share of the economy needs to shrink by 3 percentage points. And notice carefully that this is not meant as a criticism. The additional government programs may be highly desirable. All I'm trying to do is describe one of the consequences, maybe an unintended one, that's not widely understood. Now, that transition to a smaller share for the private sector manifests itself in weak business investment, because we stop growing for a while, and of course, that limits our productivity growth. Now, I can illustrate this really clearly with jobs. Today, right now, we have 15% more jobs than we had in 2015, 9 years ago. But there are 26% more public sector jobs. So who got crowded out? Well, the usual ones. Manufacturing jobs, which are only up 4% in 9 years. And resource sector jobs, which have actually fallen by 3% in 9 years. In other words, we've been replacing some of the very highest productivity jobs in our economy with jobs where measured productivity is 0. It's not because we didn't work hard as public servants. I always worked hard, honestly. But it's not measured. The output is not measured. So there is no way to assign a productivity measure to that. Obviously, the best way forward is for us to grow the economy more so that we can afford those additional programs without shrinking the private sector. And to that end, I think we should be devoting more fiscal resources to encourage companies to make those investments, to digitize their operations, deploy AI, climb up the fourth industrial revolution curve. An investment boom in Canada would be a far better way to support the economy today if tariffs are put in place, because it would create economic growth much further into the future. In other words, we use our scarce fiscal firepower not just to give people a fish to get them through to tomorrow, but instead let's give them fishing rods. Now this, after all, is why the American Canada Goose is so far in front of the rest of us. Biden's tax incentives have created a veritable business investment boom down there. If you allow me to make a little plug here, last spring the government asked me to work with the pension plans to develop ways of encouraging them to invest more in Canada. Now, my recommendations appeared in the fall economic statement in December. They were underreported because of, a few other events happened at the same time. But those recommendations represent a nonpartisan consensus developed in intense collaboration with the major pension plans and supported by hundreds of submissions from other interested Canadians. And that consensus is that those ideas would indeed move the needle on investment here in Canada. Therefore, those recommendations would make a nice complement to some of the additional things we have in mind, including additional investment tax incentives right now, regardless of who tables the next budget. Those tax incentives could be designed to encourage all companies, large but especially small, to embrace the digital revolution right now. So, time for me to conclude. I know it sounds pretty grim. We face some extreme challenges in the near term, and we confront those challenges from a weak starting point. And this will not be the last bout of volatility we face in what I call in my book, the next age of uncertainty. But I want to assure you that, apart from all that, everything's going to be just fine. But seriously, we need to keep this all in perspective. Let's tone down the rhetoric and the indignation. If we lean toward boosting business investment to build resilience today, and of course thereby grow into tomorrow, we can tap directly into the fourth industrial revolution. And that, I'm telling you, will ensure that the Canadian Canada Goose will catch that technology updraft and start closing the gap with the rest of the world. So let's look forward to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I love the image of the geese. It really is quite evocative. So You talked a lot about the future, but let me ask you, if I can, pretend you were Prime Minister today. What would you say to President Trump?
Yeah, so I hate it there, Dave. I really think that at the core, the biggest irritant, if you could actually get them to sit still for a minute, what's the biggest irritant? The biggest irritant is that since 1945, we've been spending more of our livelihood on national defense, Americans, to protect everybody else, and you guys are among those who just haven't paid your fair share. And we kind of like, yeah, but you couldn't let something happen to us because we're right beside you. Like, it's almost like, well, how could you protect yourself without protecting us? Well, that doesn't make it fair. So in my mind, it's like when you've had, this is kind of like, it could become, one of those family feud things, right? And at a certain point, it gets too far, and you go to the store and you get a really nice bottle of wine, and you go and say, Bob, I don't know how this happened, but let's sit down and talk about this. And I would say, we acknowledge that, and given the reality that we face, 1 or 2% of GDP to be added to our efforts in defense is small beer compared to the hazards that we face, and that truly is existential. And when I say that to people, they often say, yeah, but we wouldn't be able to spend the money. Procurement is hard, right? So I say, yeah, I've got an answer for that too. Let's have a special tax. We'll call it the CMT, the Canadian Military Tax. And you pay it at the cash register, I think 3%. It's not big enough to blow up anything. And those who are below a certain income line would get a bigger GST credit, like now, Right. And then we'd say, we're going to collect that money at the cash register, and we're giving it to the United States. And by the way, we could take $40 billion or so out of the current budget, because we're not going to spend money studying what we shouldn't buy anymore. Right. So you take that out, and you say, all we want out of that budget is, say, 80,000 Canadians in uniform, all with a little Canadian flag on to show that we're a little special. And we want all the same stuff that your military have. You just do the procurement, and we want the opportunity to bid on the procurement. We got shipyards, we can build submarines, we got aerospace, we can do lots of stuff. And we already have that, but let's make sure it's written down, and that's the deal. And then, you've simplified everything. People pay that tax knowing it's going straight to the people in uniform, and they'll be proud to pay it. Yeah. And I think Donald Trump would say, now that's a teammate. Right. Forget about all this other stuff I've been talking about. I think that's what I would do. But of course, it's, it almost, people say, well, you're just rolling over. Right? You're not standing up to a bully, because, maybe that's true. Maybe 6 months later, say, if you don't do this, I'm going to put 25% tariffs on you again. And I say, well, hopefully, for good neighbors, they wouldn't. Right. Yeah. Anyway, so there's some risk involved.
No, and maybe more something in your wheelhouse, I'll say. You mentioned that the Canadian dollar could be facing really serious threats. That puts the Bank of Canada in a challenging position. How do you think that the bank responds to that?
Yeah, so there's no question that if to make it concrete, suppose there were a 20% depreciation like we had in 2015. That would be the exchange rate doing its job, and one of the consequences would be inflation would pop up. It wouldn't be maybe as big as you might guess. Okay, first of all, we're starting in a weak position with downward pressure on inflation. So it would just be a one-shot deal, like prices would go up and then they'd stop going up. It would be a one-off thing. I don't think it would turn into a perpetual inflation. And going back to that episode in 2015, 16, by early 2016, we were looking at inflation that was pushing towards 3%, and about 1 or 1.25% was from the depreciation. And so, if inflation is 2 and maybe it drifts a little below 2 in the next few months, I don't know exactly, but let's say it's in that ballpark, then of course that means it sort of stays within the 1 to 3% zone, and you explain it well to people, and you say that's just a consequence of this new world that we're in, and you need to understand that imports will cost more from now on. So I think it's manageable. I think it could mean that they'd be more cautious, of course, about finding their interest rate path because they wouldn't want to light a fire.
Sure.
Of course. And of course, another thing you'd have to take into account is what is the fiscal authority doing, right? So if they're filling in the hole with other spending, then you don't want to make it really inflationary, right? So it's a complicated question you ask, but I don't think it's an insurmountable problem, and we certainly walked through it in 2015-16. That worked. We cushioned the blow to the oil producers, and had stronger economy in the east, weaker economy in the west, but we got away with it and explained it to people, and inflation didn't take off.
No, that's great. And thinking, there's obviously some fiscal solutions. It strikes me there's some non-fiscal solutions. Premier Eby, Premier Smith have said, we have to get projects built and we have to reduce the barriers. Federal government's even starting to kind of make some noise in that direction. But, today, 97% of our oil goes to one customer, 100% of our gas. And, understand it's difficult to export. But with commodities, it's not nearly as difficult to export because they just enter a world market. What would you recommend? Like, what are some of the things we can do promptly to get projects?
Well, I do know and by full disclosure, you're with TransCanada. I'm on the board of Enbridge. We know that there are ways to enhance egress, like to get more product out of Alberta in particular. And we've now got some investments that give us the option of taking gas, in particular, to other markets, right? So that's an important diversification play. At least it opens the door to diversification, but I wouldn't do it intentionally. I would just say, hey, it's still our best customer, still the biggest, most dynamic economy on earth. Like, we're not going to suddenly replace all that. It would be bonkers to do so.
Right.
And the fact that we've always stayed as dependent, that's a holding pattern. Like, if 20% of our stuff is going somewhere else, that means we've grown what's going somewhere else a lot since my EDC days, when that's what we did all day, right? Out there in the world saying, you need to see Canadian stuff. Well, that has grown a lot and kept pace, let's say, with the U.S. So we are still roughly as dependent, but in dollars, there's a lot going on somewhere else. So it's not like you can flick a switch and it's not efficient to do so. It's much better to make sure you're in your own backyard, relations are good. It's not the Hatfields and the McCoys. Where we won't quit till if somebody's dead. It's not. It shouldn't be.
Good. Well, I think you participated in an interesting debate last night, and this question that we've gotten from the crowd sort of relates to that. So, what do you see as Canadians' unique set of skills that will drive opportunities for the country, and how do we differentiate ourselves in the global economy to revitalize our growth prospects? It's an easy one.
What's the next question?
One word answer. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Look, we have among the best universities in the world, and the kids that come out of those universities are fabulous. And I can just tell you a quick anecdote. Like, Terry Matthews is a good friend of mine. But every spring he goes down to Waterloo and he interviews young folks, and he hires, 4 of them for this and 5 of them for that and 10 of them for something else. He has started more than 200 companies.
Wow.
And not one of them has ever failed. Okay? And the basic premise is, I'm just going to find the smartest kids from that engineering program, and I'm going to say, I've got a problem. My clients are saying, I've got this problem. Can you guys fix this problem? If you can, I'll give you half the company.
Wow.
Pay them nothing, basically. Off you go. And if they solve the problem, Mothership is going to buy it, right? Because the clients are actually asking for it. And there you have it. And then, of course, it gets folded in, and the kids have a reputation, and so on. So, I mean, it just shows you that we have what it takes, and some of it kind of gets buried in this, oh, we fail this and we fail that. We know there's things that we're not good at financing young companies. I'll say young as opposed to small. And that's why two of the biggest initiatives in the full economic statement try to bring fiscally neutral, government balance sheet to play on those problems. And I think we've come up with some ideas there that really could make a long-term difference. And again, I'm just urging whoever is in charge of the next government, even whether it's a short-lived one or a long-lived, I don't know. But anyway, this year, whoever's finally in charge, hopefully we can move those things ahead, because I think it will make a real difference. And that's what we need to do. We need to spend a higher percentage of our income investing in our future instead of distributing it around, so that people get cushioned. I mean, I'm proud of Canada for taking care of people. And don't get me wrong, we have to still do this. We have to be judicious about how we're sorting out. We do not have unlimited fiscal power. We have not restored our firing power that we had when the pandemic came on. Not even close.
Not even close.
Not even close. So let's not pretend that we could handle one of those. So we couldn't.
Yeah. And one of the things, it strikes me like removing interprovincial trade barriers is this kind of perennial issue everyone agrees must be fixed and yet never gets fixed.
Yeah.
Can you give a couple examples of like what are we talking about here, and what would it take to finally get to break the logjam?
Well, I think like Ian Bremmer's book, latest book says, government everywhere has gotten into a place where they can't decide anything unless they're forced to. Oh, and that sounds like I'm really criticizing governments, but no, I mean, being a politician is the hardest job on earth. And you used to be judged, when it came time to have another election. Now you're judged in real time. You're just judged all the time. And it's always bad. There's no such thing as doing a good thing. Because there's always what sounds like a million people on social media saying you're such a dolt, no matter what you do. So, and it feels very personal, and it is. So, like, I wouldn't be cut for it. But the point is that you can't decide things because of that unless there's a crisis, and here's one. So that's let's never waste a good crisis. The whole thing. What Ian's conclusion is, it means we're going to have more and more crises because our usual approach is going to be to kick the can down the road until it becomes one. Right? And so I think we just have to accept that as kind of a reality, and then be really sparse with our recommendations in the middle of the crisis. Let's not give them, like when I was doing that thing this past summer for the pensions. I mean, I got hundreds of submissions, and the vast majority, they're great, by the way, but I put them in a list in a bucket, and I said, these are all the boil the ocean recommendations. So, let's boil the ocean because we're pretty sure there's salt in there. Well, we didn't have time or the resources to do that. So I wanted 5 ideas, like not 200 ideas. Yeah. But in there, the specific examples, I think the biggest ones are labor mobility. You know how easy it is to move around the United States? Like you get a job offer, you can move states like that. It's nothing. Wait a minute. Do my credentials, my spouse's credentials may not be recognized. So we got to give up one of the incomes. If I accept that job offer, they got to spend a year and a half spend a lot of money to get their paper for that province. My son's a contractor in Ottawa, and he'd be taking his life in his hand to drive across to Gatineau and do a contract. Okay? And yet, carpenters in Gatineau can just come across and do a contract in Ottawa. What's up with that? Okay? So those are concrete examples, or, and it's like all kinds of professions that you've got these paperwork requirements. And it's accidental. When we made this federation, it's not like we had a Revolutionary War, like in the States. They had a Revolutionary War, and they said, oh, let's stop this. Now we're one nation. We instead said, those Americans are treating us bad, so why don't we get together, us guys, and we'll sign this thing, which is like Confederation, but I want to keep my powers, so there's that, so who decides, whether you can issue a stock say a Manitoba company?
Right.
Well, anyway, so, who decides what the qualifications are for a furnace in your house?
Right.
There's 8 different specification sets. Trucks, that have to put 2 more wheels down when they cross the border, or can't drive at night in some one province. Like this is all, goes on and on.
Staggering.
Yeah. So cross recognition of each other. Say, if it's good enough for Ontario, it should be good enough for Manitoba. The classic example is like if you're on a construction site, there are rules about what the ring looks like in the Johnny on the spot.
Right.
Okay? Like it has to be a perfect ring in some provinces, has to be a split ring in other provinces. And don't you ever get them mixed up.
Right.
Okay? We'll shut that site down. So, some of this sounds so silly, and yet it got there by accident because they're in charge of it.
Right.
And we need to fix that. I always dreamed of a time when you get the premiers or the finance ministers into a room, which, like Bill Morneau and I used to do a couple times a year. I said, why don't we just get them all to do, interprovincial trade today and just lock the door until they agree.
Right.
Right? Oh, I don't know if that'll work. Anyway, but we're always raising it. But imagine emerging from that door and saying, we had a meeting today and we decided we can give everybody a tax cut because we've just found a way to make the economy grow more and we'll get more taxes from that. Wouldn't that be a day?
Right.
You got 10 or 13 of them all sitting there, and our finance minister saying, yep, I helped to make that happen, and I'm so happy. But no, it's free money, and no one will pick it up.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today. That was wonderful.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much.
Stephen, on behalf of Canadian Club Toronto, I want to thank you for championing Canada's economic opportunities with your insightful and colorful address today. I really enjoyed that, and I think the imagery was really powerful. The stakes are high for our nation, and your perspectives provided helpful context that we need in the months ahead, and I think in the years ahead, to make sure that the next time hopefully we don't, but the next time, inevitably, we will find ourselves in some situation. We're not in a fragile state. We're ready to respond. And we just really appreciate the leadership that you continue to play on all of our behalf. And take comfort knowing that your expertise and experience are supporting Canada's economic strategies. So before we close, I want to invite our audiences to join us for breakfast on February 11th, when Global Head of Sustainability for BNP Paribas Asset Management, Jane Mbakshtir, will be at our podium. On Thursday, February 20th, we'll host Bonnie Crombie, leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. And on Wednesday, February 26th, we will host Susanna Pierce, country manager of Shell Canada, to discuss our energy future. Please visit our website for more information. And one more round of thanks to Crestview Strategies for supporting our event today. And lastly, I would like to thank our AV supplier, VVC Live, for facilitating today's event. Thanks, everyone, for being here. We hope to see you soon. Enjoy your afternoon.